The floor is yours now, Shiri.
Thank you, Vered, for the kind introduction, and hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. Let me share my screen, and of course, being an Israeli, feel free to interrupt me anytime with Today, I will present my work on modeling controversy in populations. This is chiefly research that I performed while I was at UMass Amherst, and along with my colleague Myung-Ha Jang and Professor James Allen. Yeah, thanks again for having me. Today, as Vered mentioned, I run AuCoDe, and I will have a few little teasers because towards the end of the talk, I will share a little bit of our current work on Parler. So for those of you who don't know, extreme right-wing social media website in the US that was very influential in the riots on January 6th in the US Capitol. So that's a little spoiler alert to keep you awake at this hour for the end of the talk. Screen's okay, right? Everyone can see it? Okay, thanks, great. So a little bit of context about me. As Vered said, I did my master's in computer science at the University of Haifa. Nurit and I met there. I wrote my thesis with Professor Gadi Landau on ahokarasic automatons, very much a theory type work. I worked in the industry, IBM research in Haifa, Answers in Jerusalem, and then in the US, Motley Fool, Google, and Facebook. And I'm a serial entrepreneur, so I founded, it's like an obsession almost, that you might say addiction. I founded 4 companies in the last decade, 3 of which are in technology, and 3 of which, but not the same 3, that are still alive and operational. So there's a Venn diagram of the tech and the alive ones. I did my master's and PhD, as Vered said, in Amherst, and the research I'm showing you today will be from my thesis. And today I run AuCoDe. We are an AI-based startup detecting controversy and disinformation, turning them into actionable intelligence. To kick us off, I want to show you a few real web pages. This is an article from the activist post purporting to show 22 medical studies that demonstrate that vaccines cause autism. Of course, we know that this is not, in fact, true. But if you are not well versed in the research, you may be convinced that this is correct. This is an article from medium.com. I'm autistic, and believe me, it's a lot better than measles. This page, which was so controversial that my PhD advisor forced us not to use the screenshot. I wanted to splash it on the front page of the article. He said, no way, are you crazy? That was one of my early introductions to controversies in the United States. So freeabortionhelp.com, this was a top advertising slot in a main search engine that starts with a G, ends with an E. You can guess which one it is. And at the time, this was, if you search the keyword abortion, this was the top advertisement that came up. And unbeknownst to the user who may be seeking an abortion, if you call this number, you will not be helped to get an abortion, but actually encouraged to consider adoption instead. And this page is actually funded by an extreme pro-life group that is not disclosed anywhere in this page. It took quite a bit of detective work to find that out. Finally, my advisor's favorite, Issel's Immuno-Oncology, a very convincing looking website that tells you to stop chemotherapy and use herbs instead to treat your cancer. Do not try this at home, please. So over the past decade, we've seen a growing interest in detecting controversy computationally. And this is not just political controversies. They can be religious, medical, and scientific. And nowhere is this more obvious right now than in the anti-vaccination conversations around COVID-19. The concerns that motivated my research almost exactly a decade ago were first and foremost the filter bubble. So you may well be familiar with this term, but for those of you who haven't heard, this is the notion that in an increasingly personalized internet, where the goal is to improve user engagement and time on page and clicks and so forth, the websites around us will show us things that we already expect to hear, and they're feeding into our confirmation bias because those are the things that are most likely to get us to click. And so we're not really seeing the whole internet, we're seeing a slice of the internet that already happens to agree with us. And the second concern is mis and disinformation. At the time of when I started my PhD, the words fake and news had never even been uttered in the same sentence. And these concerns were just starting to be realized. Of course, the problem of misinformation is ages old. It did not start with the internet, nor will it end there. And caveat emptor is Latin for buyer beware. But as we know, in an internet with an overflow of information, that is not a sustainable solution. We can't assume the burden of fact checking on every single user, nor is it realistic because many people have completely different senses of what is true and what is false. So a little bit of almost stating the obvious, but a lot of controversy online happens in social media. Technological tools and tech policy are really critical in shaping these discussions. You know, a tweak to Facebook's algorithm can completely change what people see in their feed and so forth. And there, at the time of this paper, of this writing, there were serious gaps in our theoretical and practical understanding of how to even define controversy. What does it mean for something to be controversial, shanui b'machloket, right? And it's the question that my committee asked me and said, okay, you can't graduate until you give us an answer. So today I will show you the answer that I gave them. And I will talk about modeling controversy in populations. First, I will show 3 phenomena that were unexplained under the prevailing models of controversy that existed at the time. I'll then demonstrate our definition, our proposed definition, and I'll just briefly touch on the mathematical model of contention. I won't bore you with too much math, I promise. And then we'll revisit those 3 phenomena under this new definition and see how they become explained. And then I'll briefly mention some of this other work and give you a sense of my plans for the future as well. So in the interest of time, I won't review all the related work in detail. Suffice to say that the past work, including some of my own, had one shared assumption in common. Even though there were various different features that were used to detect controversy and understand it, they all had this assumption that controversy was a single and absolute value for the topic. And this was a problem. So when my committee said, okay, well, you've done all this work on controversy, super interesting, weird, okay, whatever. What about, what is it even, like, how are you defining controversy? And I looked in the social sciences and I was not able to find a widely accepted definition. There is a famous quote from Justice Potter Stewart, and I know it when I see it, was applied in the case on pornography. And I know it when I see it might work for the Supreme Court, but for computational research, it's not replicable and it's not trustworthy, and it's not a sustainable definition either. Some people might suggest sentiment intuitively, and many people do and continue to bring that up when I mention controversy. However, both my work and others has shown that that is incorrect. And the reason is that sentiment analysis algorithms are generally designed to detect product sentiment, things like my battery life is crappy, my photos are amazing, and even maybe I love Julia Roberts and so on, but cannot capture the complex, nuanced versions of ideology and belief that are much, and argument that are much more nuanced than just I like it, I hate it. One other motivation for this definition was problematic controversy definitions and data sets that we saw in some prior work, including one paper that confounded Wikipedia vandalism with controversy, and another one that said, oh, well, there is this page called The Lamest Edit Wars. It includes things like Caesar salad, was it named after Julius Caesar or Caesar Chavez? And things like that. And they used that as a gold standard for what is controversial. I was not very happy with that. So I went out and wanted to find a new definition. And I asked myself and my colleagues, is controversy really an absolute universal quantity of a topic anywhere in the world? And actually, interestingly, my experience in growing up and living in the Middle East did not align with this, right? Because if you ask Israelis about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it's not very controversial in Israel. Most people have similar opinions. And if you ask in Gaza, they will also have similar opinions with themselves. But once you put those two communities together, something else completely happens. So this did not align with this notion of just one score for controversy for a topic. So here's some of the unexplained phenomenon that I mentioned. The first one is topics that are controversial in the general population, but are near or even complete consensus in the scientific community. Global warming, vaccines causing autism, evolution, you can think about GMOs, many other topics where in a US population or a general population that is not scientific, they can argue about it and they will say, yeah, of course, it's very controversial. But the scientists will say, no, it is not. Actually, there's no controversy here. And that statement was said to me by a friend who was studying autism, and he was very upset when I used vaccinations as an example. And he said, hey, you're perpetuating this notion that there's controversy, but there is no controversy. And I was like, okay, this does not align. Something's wrong with this picture, because I knew that there was controversy in the world because I saw it online in my work every day. But I also understood exactly what he meant. And I said, hey, we're on the same side. I agree with you. I know vaccines do not cause autism, but there is still a controversy. So that was not something that the current models were able to explain. Another one is localized controversies. Think of topics that are hotly debated in a very small community, but almost completely ignored. So I was recently giving this talk at UConn. Should the UConn Husky mascot appear on a Coors beer billboard? And that caused controversy within the University of Connecticut community. But if you live somewhere else and maybe you are not a big fan of the Huskies, or you just don't care as much, then you are not going to think that this is controversial. And in fact, it won't be at that level, at like all of the US. And now, as a brief break, please humor me and tell me in the chat what colors are this dress. Even if you've seen this photo before, and especially if you haven't. And I'll try to open the chat room so I can actually see your response. Yeah, very well known, but please share your actual colors. I will put mine in the way that I see it. Although I must admit that my colors have changed after giving, talks about this dress for so many times. I can't see it the same way anymore. So we've got a lot of gold and white. Oh, Shachar, I love it. Well, we need two colors though, right? So where's your other hex? That's a good one. I've never gotten that before. And then, yeah, so we've got some brown and lilac, we've got gold and white, blue and brown. By the way, a lot of people said black and blue in the original debate. And to some people's surprise, but anybody here has not seen this photo before, by the way, please mention it in the chat so I know, otherwise I won't bother explaining the obvious. But for those of you who don't know, this is the hashtag the dress is melted the internet. Photo of the dress that people can't agree what color it is. So some people see it as gold and white, as most people will see the left-hand side image, and other people see it as black and blue, as on the right-hand side image. And this dress, much to many people's surprise, caused a viral phenomenon that everyone from Mindy Kaling, Beyonce, and Jay-Z, and people threatening to get divorced over disagreements with their spouses. The Philadelphia police saying wanted this dress, and so on. So this leads us to our third unexplained phenomenon. By the way, it's super random, but the actual dress is black and blue, in case you didn't know. So it was just the conditions of the photograph that caused this optical illusion. I call these frivolous controversies. They may be hotly debated, but ultimately unimportant. And what colors are this dress is just one example. Think of things like the same lamest edit words that we discussed before, or what side should the toilet paper roll be in, facing forward, facing back, things like that. That led all these things were kind of puzzling, rattling around in my brain, and I was looking for a better definition that could be clearly understood and reproducible while explaining these and other phenomenon better. I don't explicitly mention the Middle East in our paper, but I do think that was one of my motivating examples, actually, that I could not resolve. And that led me to propose a new definition that have two main components. The first is that instead of a single dimension, we propose to decompose controversy into at least two separate dimensions. The first one is contention, a metric for the amount of people who disagree on the topic. And the other one is importance, a metric for how relevant or how impactful the topic is. So, I'm going to skip some of the formalisms. The full stuff is in my paper, but you can define controversy as a binary random variable. Then contention and importance are also binary random variables that we can then break apart and make them orthogonal. So to demonstrate what I mean by that, this is a plot of 53 topics from the iSide With website. This is a website where people can state their opinions on various controversies and then be told which political candidate is most similar to them. Who should they vote for, basically. And millions of people have actually filled in this survey. Every election, it becomes very popular again. And this is the data from 2014 on these 50 topics. And we plotted it by contention on the x-axis, importance on the y-axis. And here, importance was self-reported. So the users were actually explicitly asked, how important is this to you? So that the recommendation of the politician would match up with their values. And what we see here is that in the top right quadrant, there is a cluster of topics that we would intuitively expect to be controversial. Things like gun control in the US, most highly controversial, abortion, the Affordable Care Act, same-sex marriage, and so on. They have high contention, so many people disagree on them, but also rated as high importance. On the upper left quadrant, we can see things like background check for gun purchases, which is interestingly gets completely different responses than gun control itself. So Americans are fierce about their gun control, but if you ask them, should people have background checks? Well, that's not gun control, that's just background checks. So of course it is a form of gun control, but that's not what people say when they are worried about gun control. So actually this is a very popular measure, and there is not much contention on it, but people think it's still important. And also this example of national parks, should we preserve national parks? And the answer is, yeah, everybody agrees it's a good thing. Nobody's fighting over it, but they also don't think it's, and yet they think it's very important. On the flip side here, on the bottom right, we have things like, should we have incentives for trucks running on alternative fuels? Should the US end trade embargo on Cuba? And the answer is that it's quite contentious. People disagree, but they're not going to pick the politician to vote for based on whether the US is going to end trade embargoes with Cuba. Highly unlikely, unless you're Cuban American, in which case you might care very much. The second definition is, the second part of the definition is that it has to be population based. So here we break controversy to be a function not only of the topic, but also of the group of people that we're observing. So consider that omega is a group of people, and T is the topic of interest. So now we can model the probability of controversy given the population and the topic as the probability that this topic is controversial within the population specifically, as opposed to saying anywhere in the world, we're now focusing on a specific group of people. And if you put these two parts together, again, I'm kind of breezing over the math parts, but the full derivation is available online. We make an assumption of orthogonality, and we can break up controversy into the probability of contention and the probability of importance, given the combination of the topic and the population. So now is the point where I start to bore you all to tears, which is why I'm going to skip these slides real quick. But specifically for contention, we have this intuition. We would like this quantity to grow when the groups in disagreement are larger. So in other words, the way that I pose this question is, if we randomly select two people from the population, how likely are they to hold conflicting stances? And this is the actual model of contention. We want to reflect this question. So if I take person 1 and person 2 at random from the group of people, and they hold two stances, SI and SJ, person 1 is holding opinion or stance I, person 2 holds opinion or stance J, and these two stances conflict. If I model this probability across the entire population, I now have a measure of contention that will intuitively go larger as there is more conflict in the population. I'm going to skip some of this fancy stuff, but at the end, I'll skip to the answer. And at the end, we get this derivation, which is essentially, I would explain it as a portion of a binomial distribution. So if you consider that the groups of people holding the opinions, think of them as a complete coverage of the entire population. And I'll demonstrate in a moment schematically what I mean by that. So if I'm picking two people at random, either they're from the same group and then they agree, or they're from different groups and they disagree, or there's another option, which is that one or both of them do not hold an opinion on the topic at all. And so if I take all the combinations of people who disagree, and I multiply it by 2 because I might choose stance I first and then stance J, or vice versa, that will be the denominator for this probability. And the numerator is simply the size of the population squared. And in the flip, the 1 minus this is the other thing. Oh, I picked people from the same group, or I picked a person from one group and another person who doesn't have an opinion. Those people do not conflict. So that would give me the probability of not having contention. So I'm going to skip a lot of fancy math and give you an intuitive sense of what I mean by this math. If we look at a schematic for Brexit and think about contention by populations, we can see that approximately half of the people in Great Britain voted for Britain to leave the EU, and the other half voted to stay, almost exactly half. But there was also a group of people that did not have an opinion at all, or rather, maybe they had an opinion, but they didn't care enough or had the ability to make it to the voting booth. And so in this case, we will see an extremely high contention among the voting group, but the turnout matters as well. So if I only consider the group of people who actually voted, I will have almost the maximal contention possible. But if I add the people who did not have an opinion, 28% of Great Britain voters did not go to the voting booth, then I have the contention somewhat reduced because they didn't care enough to have an opinion. And then if I break it down at the regional level, Scotland had a larger stay vote than a leave vote, and versus rural England, larger leave vote versus stay. And we'll see this with real numbers in a little bit. But a really interesting example is Gibraltar. So for those of you who are up and up on your European geography, Gibraltar is physically located within mainland EU, but it is from a political standpoint part of Great Britain. So people in Gibraltar naturally were not interested in being cut off from the rest of the continent, and thus were extremely opposed to Brexit. So we have this new definition. It sounds great. Let's check it out. In order to validate this definition, we collected 5 data sets that had explicit stances embedded in them. So people were expressing their opinion in a very clear manner. And then we also created 3 data sets that had implicit stances. For example, by looking at the hashtags that people use on their tweets. So how are we doing on time? Yeah, I have a little time. So I already mentioned the eyesight with data set that had millions of people overall, although it varied from question to question. There are 2 studies from Pew Research. One studied the general adult population, and the other one studied scientists specifically with statistically calibrated surveys on 13 controversial issues in the scientific domain. And those 2 surveys had thousands of people. The BuzzFeed on the dress had 3 million people at the time of writing. That number keeps going up. By the way, people still filling out that same poll. But we took that as just to see what would come out of it, and also to compare it with the Twitter dress. And also we took the official public voting records for Brexit itself, with 46 million people voting. With respect to Twitter, we collected 24 million tweets with 18 million, nearly 19 million users between 2015 and 2016. And these were collected from the garden hose. So that is a random 1% sample of all of Twitter. So I promised you to show you the actual contention in Brexit. This is a map of Great Britain. Unfortunately, we didn't have the county by county breakdown for Ireland, but what you can see here is the contention at each county in the UK with respect to Brexit. So the redder it is, the more contentious it is. And here we only looked at people who actually went to the polls. We did not factor turnout in. And you can see that even though Brexit was very controversial overall, it was not uniformly contentious across all the UK. In rural England, there are pockets of much less disagreement here and here. And then in London, the reverse is true, or actually the same is true, but for the opposite reason. Much more people who voted stay in downtown London. Gibraltar is such an outlier, I can't even put it on the same color scheme without throwing off everything else. But it is an extremely low contention, as I already alluded to. Now, with respect to Twitter data, we see a somewhat interesting pattern that is a little bit different. On the left-hand side, what you're seeing here is the contention in the overall population of tweets that day. So in using the garden hose as an approximation, we estimate what is the contention of Brexit with respect to the entire population of Twitter that was posting between May and August. And we have a day-by-day contention, and we see some spikes, some miniature spikes leading up to the voting day, but on the referendum day itself, the spike is just completely out of proportion and registers even at the level of all of Twitter. When we only focus on people who are posting actively about Brexit, we can see that a very, very different pattern. So here we have continuous contention almost throughout the entire period from May to August, with a definite high around voting day, but not explicitly so. It's contentious all around before and after, and we can see some of these earlier peaks kind of showing up here, but to a much lesser degree, and only dropping off to zero occasionally on some quiet days over a month after the referendum. With respect to some US results, this is a state-by-state contention plot of the gun control question. And by the way, if you have time later, hopefully you can see this. Let me know if this is visible. Feel free to check out our demo, live demo. Here you can see all the 52 topics, and you can find a state-by-state map of contention for each one of these topics, and you can kind of browse it like, oh, Colorado had much less contention, even in 2014, which also explains why it was one of the first states to legalize marijuana, and the New England region does not feel very strongly against marijuana legalization. So this is just one example, but again, 50 different topics here, and you can see them one by one: Common Core, domestic policy, etc. So this is just one example, but what you can see here is that, interestingly, for gun control specifically, there's a very clear pattern of high contention in the coastal areas, which, for those of you who know the United States, very liberal areas, some parts of the Midwest as well, very contentious. But in the sort of upper Midwest and places like Alaska and the Deep South, this is not a very contentious issue because everyone opposes gun control. And this here, same idea as with Brexit. We've got on the left contention across all of Twitter, on the right only within people who actively posting on the 2016 US elections. And a couple of interesting comments here is that we saw very clear spikes in this context around the first, second, and third debate. But there was also a spike that at first we didn't understand what it was. And when we looked at what happened on that day, that was actually the day that the infamous Hollywood Access tape was released. So Donald Trump saying, talking about alleged sexual assault on tape that was released 2 days before the second debate. And it was very interesting to see that pattern because I personally was one of the people who posted with #NotOK after this tape came out. So you might argue that a little bit of participatory research here. But again, this big spike on voting day. And we see a similar pattern here as we saw in Brexit among the population that is posting actively. We can see that the contention is high throughout, but here we see much more clearly the same exact spikes that we see on the left-hand side are very prominent in this graph, right? Even within this smaller population, there's clear increase in contention around certain days. And by the way, the red line is the contention among the actual voting results, if you take the popular vote as a mark. So Hillary Clinton actually won far more than 50% of the, or not far more, but 50, I think it was like 52, 53% of the popular vote to do with quirks in the American political system for those paying attention. So I promised to circle back to the unexplained phenomenon, and now we can understand them better under this new definition. So you can see here that these topics, the scientific topics that we discussed, we can now understand them as topics with high contention in a general population and extremely low contention in the scientific community. So to visualize that, I have another schematic for you. So on the left-hand side, imagine the general US population, fairly high contention. You can think about any topic of scientific argument here that we mentioned before, evolution, climate change, etc. But if you zoom in to a subgroup that includes only the scientific community in the US, now you have a very, very different picture, an extremely low contention with some scientists still contesting these research results, but by and large, the vast majority agreeing that evolution is true, climate change is definitely happening, and vaccines do not cause autism. And this is an actual data demonstration of this intuition. So here I mentioned the Pew Research study. On the y-axis, you can see contention among general US adults, and on the x-axis, contention among scientists. And so if it's above the x equals y axis, that means it's more contentious among US adults and less contentious among scientists. And you can see that, as we would expect, evolution, the use of animals in research, climate change, etc., are all highly controversial and contentious in the US adult population, but very low contention among scientists. Whereas other topics such as the use of nuclear power, offshore drilling, should we send human astronauts to space, and fracking, they were contentious both among scientists and among the US adult population. Second unexplained phenomena is these localized controversies, and we can now understand these same local hot topics as having a very different contention depending on the population being observed. So here we see a different picture. We have a large population that is generally agnostic to this particular topic. That's what the gray signifies. But if you zoom into that small population for which the topic is important, now you get a much higher contention. The third phenomenon is the frivolous controversies, and these are very easily now explained as high contention and low importance topics. So just for good measure, here is the same data and the same analysis on Twitter. The contention peaks on the day of the BuzzFeed article being published and stays, drops almost immediately back down within 24 hours. And among people who continue to post on the dress, it continues to be contentious, but that group is rather small. And the importance of this topic is negligible, but with the exception of a small burst of scientific papers studying visual perception of this unexpected effect, and then, of course, my own paper. So for me, the dress was quite important in that respect. So to summarize, I presented a new theoretical definition of controversy that also has practical implications. It has two main components. First, it is multidimensional. It's comprised of contention and importance. And it is population-based, so it's dependent not only on the topic, but also on the group being observed. And this model carries greater explanatory power than any previous definition of controversy that existed in literature. And we evaluated it on multiple data sets, including surveys, voting data, and Twitter as well. I can pause here for some questions, or we can wait to the end. Vera, what do you think?
Yeah, if you have any questions, you can write them on the chat. And I would love to hear what you promised at the beginning with the parallel analysis.
Yes, I promise I'll do that. Yeah, so I'll let people have a chance to ask if they want, or of course we can have more time at the end. So, just to give you a very brief sense of the rest of my thesis, analysis and detection was the title, and I analyzed theoretical and practical aspects of controversial topics online. As I alluded to earlier, I demonstrated that controversy is distinct from sentiment, but that it is closely tied to topics such as bias, fact disputes, and disinformation. And throughout my PhD, I used multiple data sets, including Wikipedia, Twitter, news, and general websites, as well as surveys and 2 annotated corpora. If we have time at the end, I can show you, I might have some backup slides with a couple interesting things on that. But let me tell you just briefly about my startup, AuCoDe. In April 2016, after having interned at Facebook and getting a distinct sense that Mark Zuckerberg wasn't going to do anything about these problems, the filter bubble, etc., I founded my own startup to bring this technology to market. As Vera had mentioned, I won the first place in the UMass Innovation Challenge and had 2 patents filed through the university that are on exclusive license to my company. And we've been very fortunate to receive support from the National Science Foundation to the tune of $1 million in funding for this startup. And so it's similar if you think about the Madan, innovation. I always forget the new name, but I think you all know what I mean. I'm gonna get the, sorry, Vera, yeah, remind me what is the acronym. I'm definitely gonna get it wrong. Innovation Authority, or yeah. So they have a new name, but the Madan in Israel, so it's a similar idea, but the National Science Foundation doesn't take equity or royalties at all. So it's like a wonderful gift that we're extremely grateful for. And as I mentioned, thanks Vered for keeping everyone awake and excited at this late hour. We, on January 6th, while all the eyes of the world were on the US Capitol, my team went and scraped Parler, which was, as I kind of mentioned, this extreme right wing social media group website, and it was actually opened as an alternative to some of the more mainstream websites that you can think of, Facebook, Twitter, etc., and Reddit, where increasingly the content is being moderated for disinformation and violence. So people who founded Parler believe strongly in free speech. It's an ongoing question whether, in the US, whether that is the be all and end all, or should we be restricting speech that can be harmful. But specifically, Parler is attractive to people who are kind of feeling jaded and left out of the mainstream social media website. And so we scraped Parler and collected a data set from the January 6th day of the riots until the 11th, when Parler was taken down by the cloud providers that were providing the service for and hosting their servers. So that was actually, they actually decided to stop hosting, and they can now not, they've been trying to put something back up, but they haven't really been able to revive the website. So we were able to collect 670,000 comments from nearly 300,000 users. And, in Israel, I don't think this content warning will be as relevant, but there is some things here that are disturbing. So just keep that in mind. On the right-hand side is a word cloud of the most common words used on this data set. So we see things like people, country, will, don't, Antifa, by the way, which is anti-fascism, is short for anti-fascism, which is often a sort of used as a straw man argument in the right-wing community. And we can see that a very simple analysis that we ran, I mean, keep in mind, this is all very early days. We're still making sense of this data set, but the very first thing we said, okay, let's take a look at trigrams, right? What are the most frequent trigrams that appeared in this data set? And far and away, the most frequent was "we need to." There were also things like "thank you for," "we the people," which is a rallying cry in the U.S. It's part of the Constitution and so on. Needs to be is going to the American people, but then notice this one here. Antifa and BLM short for Black Lives Matters. So there's definitely a lot of talk on this right-wing forum on Antifa and BLM and the United States, etc. We wanted to see, okay, we need to what? So we also analyzed, okay, what are the most frequent we need to blank? We need to win this, we need to start, we need to act now, stand up, but also we need to get rid, we need to start blowing, we need to take our, so you can see there are a lot of calls to action, some of which are implying violence. Here we took the contention metric, the same one that I described to you earlier, and we chose the top 5 most contentious comments on this in this data set. And so we have the first one is a rant of sorts, you might say, with extreme conspiracy theories like claiming that Biden has Alzheimer's, Harris and her husband are slaves of the CCP, and so on. Everything is a very deep state like mindset for those of you familiar with the QAnon type discussions. And interestingly, this comment, even though it garnered some agreement, it also garnered quite a bit of disagreement. And therefore, it was actually the most contentious comment in the entire data set. So we can see that even the users of Parler are not kind of a one size fits all. And to some extent, there were moderate right-wing, and of course, after the Capitol riots, there were also quite a bit of left-wing people who joined almost to make a point. The second most contentious was this conspiracy theory that Antifa people were the ones who stormed the riot in order to make Trump look bad, and that they were faking it. They were Antifa people dressed in Trump attire as opposed to actual Trump supporters and so on. And this comment is kind of interesting about First Amendment rights, etc. And it's unclear if it was contentious specifically because of the discussion of the First Amendment or the curse words sprinkled very freely throughout this post. So I'll leave that as a thought exercise for the audience. So that is, again, just some very small taste of what we've been doing. And, you know, just in the interest of, and skip the future work slide. And thank you so much for joining me this evening, and happy to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Shiri. I will stop now the recording, so we will